Okay, we are live, so you can go ahead and do the introduction, Peter.
Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you again. And I'm sure that a number of other people will be coming in as they find the moment to join us. Once again, introducing Violetta Zain, who's presenting on the Life of Abdu'l-Bahá. This is going to be the sixth session. And we're this is destined to go through the beginning of October. We haven't determined exactly the date that it will end because we don't know how long it will take. But she's determined to go to the end, and hooray for her. So this program is brought to you by the BBC. No, I'm kidding. By the Desert Rose Baha'i Institute, by the Firm Foundation Academy, and by the Clearwater Bahais. And I'll be with you in a minute. And we're very happy to have you join us. And with no further ado, here is Violetta.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to day 6 of the storytelling of the extraordinary life of Abdul-Bahá. Yesterday was a very difficult day because we covered the ascension of Baha'u'llah and Abdul-Bahá becoming the center of the covenant. And we also covered the covenant-breaking forces that are going to plague Abdul-Bahá the next 10 years. So it was quite a difficult and very intense session. We also ended with the plan for Shoghi Effendi's parents to get married. And we looked at Abdul-Bahá retiring to the lower cave of Elijah on Mount Carmel a few months after the ascension of Baha'u'llah to isolate himself from the covenant breakers. And upon his return, we looked at what pilgrimage was like with Abdul-Bahá in the years immediately following the ascension of Baha'u'llah. And so today we're going to start on a very different note. Remember yesterday, we looked at the 3 objectives of Abdul-Bahā's ministry, his self-imposed objectives, which he repeated often to people during his ministry. And the first one was the establishment of the cause in America. The second one was the erection of the first Bahá'í House of Worship in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. And the third one was the building of the shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel in the place indicated by Baha'u'llah. And so today, we began with one of the first objective of Abdul-Bahā's ministry, and it's a little story about how Abdul-Bahá foreshadows the victory of the faith in the West 1 year after the ascension of Baha'u'llah, when he reveals a verse which foreshadows the victory of the faith in the West. And this verse incurs the mockery of the covenant breakers. The verse in question, mentioned by Shoghi Effendi, is not quoted in God Passes By. But the idea of the promulgation of the cause of Baha'u'llah in the West, the first among Abdul-Bahā's stated aims of his ministry, is to be one of the greatest triumphs of his mystery in the upcoming journeys to the West. The United States is to be preeminent among all the countries of the West, both in bounties conferred upon it by God and its extraordinary efforts to spread the faith to the rest of the world. It's important to remember that the rulers of America have the bounty of being addressed directly by Baha'u'llah in the Kitabi Aqdas, and the members of the Baha'i community have the honor of being titled by Shoghi Effendi to be the spiritual descendants of the dawnbreakers of the heroic age of the Baha'i dispensation. And the image that I chose here is a slice of life in America in 1893, when this verse of Abdul-Bahá is revealed regarding the victories of the faith in the West. It's the Grand Army of the Republic's Veteran Review on the 5th of September, 1893 in Indianapolis, Indiana. That same year, exactly 1 year after the ascension of Baha'u'llah, the name of Baha'u'llah is spoken for the first time publicly in Chicago. This also fits with this grand aim of AbdulBaha. And this is a photograph of the first religious parliament in Chicago in 1893. It is in this exact parliament that the name of Baha'u'llah is first publicly mentioned. The Reverend H. Jessup, D.D., Director of Presbyterian Missionary Operations in North Syria, reads a paper at this World Parliament of Religions held in Chicago. In his paper, Reverend Jessup announces that a, quote, famous Persian sage, the Babi saint, has recently died in Akka, and closes by saying that he feels moved to share Edward Granville Brown's recounting of his visit to Baha'u'llah 1 year before his ascension, because the sentiments are, quote, so noble, so Christ-like, expressed by Baha'u'llah. And now that same momentous year, 1 year after the ascension of Baha'u'llah, AbdulBahr writes the first important treatise of his ministry on leadership. This is the original text of a widely obeyed December 1891 fatwa against tobacco use, issued by the Grand Ayatollah Mirza Hassan Shirazi in protest against the British monopoly on tobacco, which had been granted by the Shah. The revolt and ensuing political movement about which AbdulBahr writes in his treatise happen soon after this fatwa is enacted. AbdulBahr writes his second major treatise after The Secret of Divine Civilization in 1875. This is his first major treatise as the center of the covenant. It is called Risaliye-i Sisaye and deals with societal and leadership questions in the aftermath of the tobacco revolt in Persia in 1892, widely considered to be the very first political movement in Iran's history. AbdulBaha asks the Persian Bahais to widely disseminate the work and summarizes the contents himself in this way. In that epistle, the sacred rights of the state and the protected rights of the nation, the relationship between rulers and their subjects, and the ties between those who govern and those who are governed, and the obligation of those who lead and those who are led have been set forth. In 1893, still, the Russian publication of Baha'u'llah's Kitabi Ahd, the Book of His Covenant. This is a collaboration with Dr. Christopher Buck and Yuli Ioannessian. The man pictured here is Baron Rosen, who published the Kitabi Ahd, and the man to the left is Andalib, the Baha'i poet. His poem is included in this publication because he wrote a martier, a lamentation on the ascension of Baha'u'llah, because he was present during that time. And it is published along with the Kitabi Ahd. And the Kitabi Ahd is published in Arabic and in Russian. And if you go to this page on the chronology, you can download the article by Christopher Buck and Dr. Yuli Ioannessian by clicking on this graphic. And now we make progress on the second stated aim of AbdulBah's ministry. In 1893, 1894, AbdulBah approves the design of the first Bahá'í House of Worship in Ashgabat. And this picture is extraordinary. We see here in the center, Haji Mirza Muhammad Taqi Afnan, surnamed Vakilud Daole. He is the maternal cousin of the Bab. He is the one who largely paid for and supervised the building of the House of Worship, and he is holding what looks to be like the drawings for the House of Worship. While Ustad Ali Akbar is on pilgrimage, the builder, he designs the main features of the House of Worship in Ishkabad under the direction of AbdulBahr, who conceives the plan for the 9-sided building. This is a very summarized map, of course, only showing a very small fraction of the stops of the remains of the Bab to Haifa here on the left in blue, from Tehran up here in purple plum, down south to Esfahan, up north, then west from Kermanshah to Baghdad, and then straight west to Damascus and Beirut, and by ship to Akka. Now AbdulBahr begins making progress on the third aim of his ministry. Only 2 years after the ascension of Baha'u'llah, he has already begun working on all 3 of his aims. And this one is in 1894, when AbdulBahr approves the transfer of the remains of the Bab to a new location. This here is a book by Michael V. Day. It is a book I highly recommend because I am going to be presenting very summarized vignettes of the building of the shrine of the Bab by AbdulBahr. But in this book, you can read 1,000,000 times more details, and it's extremely well written. So I highly recommend it. It's called Journey to a Mountain, and it's the first in a trilogy of books on the shrine of the Bab, all the way through the ministry of the Guardian. The other ones are Coronation on Carmel, and that's the ministry of the Guardian, and then Sacred Stairway, and that's in the time of the Universal House of Justice. But for our purposes today, in 1894, this is what precedes it. A new wave of persecution against the Baha'is in Persia in 1891, 1892 threatens the safety of the casket containing the holy remains of the Bab. And AbdulBahr orders the remains of the Bab be moved to a new location until 1898. And now back to the first aim of AbdulBahr. In February 1894, now almost 2 years after the ascension of Baha'u'llah, Khairullah begins systematically teaching the faith in America. On the left here, standing in dark coat with a mustache, sitting with a mustache, is Khairullah. Ibrahim George Khairullah, a Syrian man who is not actually a doctor, becomes a Baha'i in 1892 after receiving a tablet from Baha'u'llah, and communicates with AbdulBahr before moving to New York in December 1892. In February 1894, he relocates to Chicago and begins actively and systematically teaching the faith. Sometime after June 1894, Thornton Chase becomes the American Baha'i, and he is surnamed Tabit by AbdulBahr, Tabit meaning steadfast. And the faith grows rapidly in America between 1894 and 1896. These are some early American Baha'is, and those who have a golden border will be named by Shoghi Effendi disciples of AbdulBahr. They are among the first Baha'is in America. We have Lua Getzinger, Edward Getzinger, Howard McNutt, Arthur P. Dodge, Isabella Brittingham, Lillian Capps, Paul K. Daly, Chester Thatcher with a beautiful beard, and Helen Goodall. Between 1894 and 1896, Ibrahim Khairullah shares his impressions and reports on the remarkable success of his teaching efforts with AbdulBahr. In 1895, Kenosha, Wisconsin proved receptive, and Khairullah visited Kenosha once a week. By 1896, the number of Baha'is in Kenosha and Chicago number in the hundreds. In 1897, Khairullah publishes a book, the Babu'd-Din, and converts a considerable number of people to the Baha'i faith in Kansas City. Among these early Baha'is are these 9 whom we've just read their names. For a considerable amount of time, and in late 1895, early 1896, AbdulBahr retreats to Tiberias. And this is a panoramic view of the town of Tiberias on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Bent under the heavy weight of the grief occasioned by Baha'u'llah's ascension and dismayed by the evil schemings of his own family, now covenant breakers, AbdulBahr retreats to Tiberias, about 50 kilometers from Akka, with only one servant as a companion. 50 kilometers is a very long way in those times to travel by mule. AbdulBahr says, AbdulBahr stays there a considerable amount of time, according to Bahari Ma'ani, a Baha'i historian who wrote Leaves of the Twin Divine Tree, but there is no exact duration provided. In Tiberias, AbdulBahr prays and communes with God, surrounded by the desert, which has seen the footsteps and the lamentation of many of the manifestations of God of the pasts, and says in a tablet to Munir Hanum, written during his retreat, although this servant is outwardly alone, the breezes of the kingdom of Abha are wafting, and the bounties of the blessed beauty descending. The remembrance of his countenance is my companion, and from all else I have severed my hope. In this desert for many years, his holiness Christ uttered, here am I, O God, here am I. And in this wilderness for several centuries, the prophets and the chosen ones associated together. The fragrance of their remembrance hath perfumed the mountains and the field, and the quickening breezes have imbued the desert and the sea with new life. Should the sense of hearing be refined, it would at this very moment hear those lamentations and supplications, and would perceive those melodies with the inner ear. And while AbdulBaha is away in late 1895, early 1896, Shoghi Effendi's parents wed in a simple ceremony. This is a portrait of a young Bahiye Khanum, the greatest holy leaf. Around 1895, exactly around the time she is the one who oversees the wedding of Shoghi Effendi's parents. Mirza Hadi Afnan, Shoghi Effendi's soon-to-be father, returns to Akka. In the 4 years since his return to Shiraz in 1892, he and his mother have written constant letters to AbdulBaha, Munir Hanum, and Bahiye Hanum about the hand of AbdulBaha's eldest daughter, Ziyaye Hanum. As Mirza Hadi Afnan arrives, while AbdulBaha is in retreat in Tiberias, the family write to the master, who consents to the marriage, but states the wedding must be very simple. AbdulBaha also reveals a special untranslated tablet in Arabic for the occasion. Mirza Hadi Afnan and Ziyaye Hanum are wed in a very simple ceremony, which takes place under Bahiye Hanum's supervision, bringing great joy to the Holy Family. In a gesture of kindness, Mirza Muhammad Ali's family is invited to the simple wedding. This is, of course, the covenant-breaking half-brother of AbdulBaha. He and his family come to the wedding and mock the simplicity of it with so much ridicule that none of the friends or the Holy Family are aware this is a day of celebration. October 1896, AbdulBaha rents the house of Abdullah Pasha. This is the house of Abdullah Pasha in the 1920s. 4 years after Baha'u'llah's ascension, it becomes obvious that the house of Abud is now too small to accommodate the need of AbdulBaha's family. The master arranges to rent the main building of the former governorate of Abdullah Pasha in northwestern Mujaddali neighborhood of Akka. We know this building as the House of Abdullah Pasha. In November 1896, Muhammad Ali widely publicizes his covenant breaking. This is how he does it. He sends out letters with misleading statements and calumnies against AbdulBahr, widely publicizing his covenant breaking activities. And at this point, AbdulBahr can no longer conceal his unfaithfulness. By November 1896, January 1897, AbdulBahr returns to the cave of Elijah on Mount Carmel because he finds the situation in Akka absolutely intolerable. And finally, some marvelous news. On the 1st of March, 1897, Shoghi Effendi is born. This is a photograph of a very young Shoghi Effendi, might be 2 years old in this picture. On the first day of the month of fasting in 1897, Shoghi Effendi is born in an upper room of the south wing of the house of Abdullah Pasha. Shoghi Effendi is descended from Baha'u'llah on his mother's side and related to the Bab on his father's side. In his will and testament, which AbdulBahr will begin writing very shortly, AbdulBahr refers to Shoghi Effendi's dual sanctified lineage, salutation and praise, blessing and glory rest upon that primal branch of the divine and sacred lot tree, grown out, blessed, tender, verdant, and flourishing from the twin holy trees, the most wondrous, unique, and priceless pearl that doth gleam out of the twin surging seas. Shoghi Effendi's childhood is a happy one, at all times, utterly and completely focused on his beloved grandfather, AbdulBahr. He is the ringleader of the other children, possesses an irrepressible exuberance and boundless energy. One day in his early childhood, AbdulBahr gives in to Shoghi Effendi and writes on a used envelope a short sentence for him to read to please him, because that is what he had been asking. This is the sentence written by AbdulBahr. Shoghi Effendi is a wise man, but he runs about very much. During Shoghi Effendi's childhood, it is the family's custom to rise at dawn and spend the first hour of the day in AbdulBahr's room for prayers. After the prayers, the family has a simple breakfast, very hot and very sweet tea brewed on the Russian brass samovar, served in little crystal glasses, pure wheat bread and goat's cheese. And now, as I told you, AbdulBahr is so focused on these three main aims in these early years. Around 1897, AbdulBahr orders the construction of a sarcophagus and a coffin for the remains of the Bab. This is an extraordinary photograph of the Bahais of Burma, whom AbdulBahr requested build a sarcophagus, marble sarcophagus? Yes, a marble sarcophagus. And at the same time, a very precious wood casket, coffin, for the remains of the Bab, which are in a box. The box will be put in the coffin, and the coffin will be put in the sarcophagus. That is the plan. Such a sacred trust as the remains of the Bab require a befitting vessel for their interment. So 12 years before he completes the shrine of the Bab, AbdulBahr already begins an extensive correspondence with the Bahais of Burma. He gives them a plan and very specific instructions for the construction of a marble sarcophagus. This, I'm just going to go off script for 1 second and say, during the ministry of Baha'u'llah, if you read or you listen to the chronology that we just completed, you'll see that several times during his ministry, Baha'u'llah gave to the letter specific instructions about certain things. And now with AbdulBahr, the center of the covenant, we see that he does the exact same thing. He gives very detailed plans when he asks for people to do things for him. The one-piece sarcophagus should be of the finest marble. And AbdulBahr instructs Mishkin Kalam on a visit to Burma to inscribe Ya Baha'u'l-Abha, O glory of the all-glorious, and Ya Ali Wallah, O exalted of the most exalted ones, on the sides of the sarcophagus. AbdulBahr also orders a hardwood coffin of the best Indian wood. For more details on this sarcophagus and the coffin and the entire correspondence with Burma and AbdulBahr, please read Michael Day's book, Journey to a Mountain. Sometime after the 1st of March, 1897, some years, a child will lead them. This is a photograph of Shoghi Effendi, who seems to be about 3 or 4 years old in this photograph. A believer in the United States. Now you see how the work of AbdulBahr, directing the efforts of Khairullah, trying to, because Khairullah is a difficult man, the believers in the United States start writing to AbdulBahr now. So this first object of his ministry is starting to coalesce. A believer in the United States writes to AbdulBahr upon hearing that his first grandchild is born. She writes asking about the verse and the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6, that states, the wolf will live with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the goat, the calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. AbdulBahr reveals a very deeply significant tablet in return. O maidservant of God, verily that child is born and is alive, and from him will appear wondrous signs that thou wilt hear of in the future. Thou shalt behold him endowed with the most perfect appearance, supreme capacity, absolute perfection, consummate power, and unsurpassed might. His face will shine with a radiance that illumines all the horizons of the world. Therefore, forget this not, as long as thou dost live, inasmuch as ages and centuries will bear traces of him. Sometime in the first year of his life, when Shoghi Effendi is an infant, we have some beautiful stories with AbdulBahr. And this is a photograph of AbdulBahr's room in the house of Abdullah Pasha. A 4-month-old Shoghi Effendi is brought to the reception room of Abdullah Pasha. Dr. Yunus Khan, who has promised himself to only look at the baby as a Baha'i child, is compelled to bow low before the baby. He kisses the hair on his head and senses such power within him that he is speechless. The face of Shoghi Effendi will remain with him for a few days after this encounter, and Dr. Khan will have the same experience again in Shoghi Effendi's presence twice, when the child is 9 and 11 years old. While Shoghi Effendi is still a baby, AbdulBahr calls one of the Muslims who chants in the mosque to come once a week and chant the sublime verses of the Quran in his melodious voice to Shoghi Effendi. One night, while still an infant, Shoghi Effendi wakes up crying one night. AbdulBah asks his nurse to bring Shoghi Effendi to him so that he can comfort him. And he tells his sister, the greatest holy leaf, see, he already has dreams. In 1898, Phoebe Hurst organizes the first Baha'i pilgrimage. This is Phoebe Apperson Hurst, born in 1842 and died in 1919, the first woman regent of the University of California, wife of George Hurst and mother of William Randolph Hearst. She is the organizer of the very first Western pilgrimage to the presence of AbdulBahr in 1898. Mrs. Phoebe Hurst, the well-known philanthropist and wife of Senator George F. Hurst, who becomes a Baha'i through Lua Getzinger, makes plans to visit AbdulBahr in the Holy Land. She invites Bahais, including Dr. Edward Getzinger and his wife, Lua Getzinger, Dr. Khairullah and his wife, to join her. They leave America and are joined in Paris by May Ellis Bowles, later May Maxwell, and the future mother of the future wife of the future guardian. May Ellis Bowles was also taught by Lua Getzinger. Also joining are Miss Pearson and Anne Apperson, nieces of Phoebe Hurst, Mrs. Thornburg and her daughter. In Egypt, Dr. Khairullah's daughters and their grandmother, recently declared, join the party. And these are the first Western pilgrims. Back row, left to right, Robert Turner, the first African-American Baha'i. Next to Robert Turner, Anne Apperson, a niece of Phoebe Apperson Hurst. Holding the greatest name on the other side is Julia Pearson, Mrs. Hurst's assistant and tutor for a young cousin not shown. In the front row, left to right, we have one daughter of Ibrahim Khairullah from his first marriage, Marian Khairullah, the wife of Khairullah. This is Khairullah in the center, of course, in the center. Lua Getzinger on the right, and the second daughter of Ibrahim Khairullah from his first marriage. These 15 pilgrims arrive in successive parties, not all at once, in the prison city of Akka. The first group arrives on December 8th, 1898, and then a week later, and then finally on February 13th and on February 20th, 1899. This marks the opening of a new epoch and the development of the faith in the West. The pilgrims arrive in different groups, and as a precaution, the intimate personal contact between them and AbdulBahr transforms them all, except for the very ambitious and combative Khairullah, who will break the covenant upon his return to New York. The pilgrims also include Mrs. Hurst's butler, Robert Turner, who is the first African-American Baha'i and remains a staunch Baha'i, whereas Phoebe Hurst eventually becomes estranged from the faith. AbdulBahr leads the pilgrims himself into the innermost shrine of Baha'u'llah. His loving and generous hospitality, his passionate appeals, his inspiring instructions, and the many expressions of love kindle the hearts and spirits of the pilgrims with zeal, and they return to the West to win extraordinary victories for the faith. This deserves a book, and luckily for us, there is one, for incredible details and wonderful stories on the pilgrims in Akka during the years 1897-1911. Please read Earl Redman's book, Visiting AbdulBahr, Volume 1, The West Discovers the Master, between 1897 and 1911, published by George Ronald. There is a Volume 2, for the visits to AbdulBahr after he travels to the West. In the winter of 1898-1899, during his pilgrimage, Thornton Chase watches AbdulBahr minister to the people of Akka. And this is a photograph of the tent of AbdulBaha pitched in the courtyard of the house of Abdullah Pasha, with which Thornton Chase speaks about. This is in 1907, so 10 years earlier, AbdulBaha still had this tent. When Thornton Chase arrives in Akka, the men are led to the house of Abdullah Pasha, up the long flight of broken ancient stone steps to their rooms, adjoining the one of AbdulBaha. From their room, they can see the sea, the inner garden, and AbdulBaha's tent. Ta-da! This tent is where AbdulBaha meets daily visitors and officials who call on him. AbdulBaha's tent in the courtyard is in plain view of the governor of Akka, who can watch AbdulBaha tirelessly minister, counsel, and help the citizens of Akka. The profound spiritual impact of AbdulBaha on the Western pilgrims. I'm going to let you look at this image for just a second while I drink some water. Here are some Western pilgrims to Akka in 1901. Seated in the front row, on the left, Ethel Jenner Rosenberg, Madam Jackson, Shoghi Effendi, on the lap of Helen Ellis Cole, Lua Getzinger next to her, and this woman on the extreme right is Imogen Hogue, an extraordinary, a giant of the faith. Standing on the left is a young Charles Mason Remy. Then the young man here is Sigurd Russell. On the other side of the greatest name with the nice mustache is Edward Getzinger. And next to him, Laura Clifford Barney, the future wife of Hippolyte Dreyfus, first French Baha'i. The first impressions of AbdulBaha by Westerners are very powerful. One pilgrim quoted by Shoghi Effendi says, "Of that first meeting, I can remember neither joy nor pain nor anything that I can name. I had been carried away suddenly to too great a height. My soul had come in contact with the divine spirit. And this force, so pure, so holy, so mighty, had overwhelmed me. We could not remove our eyes from his glorious face. We heard all that he said. We drank tea with him at his bidding, but existence seemed suspended. And when he arose and suddenly left us, we came back with a start to life, but never again, oh, never again, thank God, the same life on this earth." Another pilgrim said, "In the might and majesty of his presence, our fear was turned to perfect faith, our weakness into strength, our sorrow into hope, and ourselves forgotten in our love for him." This is exactly what Baha'u'llah was talking about in the last years of his life when he said he wished people could come straight to the presence of Abdul-Baha because they could have only pure thoughts in his presence. As we all sat before him waiting to hear his words, some of the believers wept bitterly. He bade them dry their tears, but they could not for a moment. So again, he asked them for his sake not to weep, nor would he talk to us and teach us until all tears were banished. And Mrs. Phoebe Hurst, quoted by Shoghi Effendi in God Passes By, "Those 3 days were the most memorable of my life. The master I will not attempt to describe. I will only state that I believe with all my heart he is the master. And my greatest blessing in this world is that I have been privileged to be in his presence and look upon his sanctified face. Without a doubt, Abbas Effendi is the Messiah of this day and generation, and we need not look for another." In another letter, she said, "I must say he is the most wonderful being I have ever met or ever expect to meet in this world. The spiritual atmosphere which surrounds him and most powerfully affects all those who blessed by being near him is indescribable. I believe in him with all my heart and soul, and I hope all who call themselves believers will concede to him all the greatness, all the glory, and all the praise, for surely he is the Son of God, and the Spirit of the Father abideth in him. When these God-intoxicated pilgrims, pictured here are Mary Bowles Maxwell, in Paris with Edith McKay. When these God-intoxicated pilgrims returned to France and to the United States, an outburst of systematic and sustained teaching activity takes place, which gathers momentum and spreads over Western Europe and all of North America. AbdulBahr decides that as soon as he is released from incarceration by the Ottoman government, he will himself undertake a personal mission to the West. And on the 31st of January, 1899, finally, at long last, the remains of the Bab arrive in the Holy Land. And this is Akka, viewed from the beach, in honor of the remains of the Bab approaching by sea. This is the date when they arrive from Beirut. And then once they arrive, from the 31st of January for approximately 1 year, the remains of the Bab are stored in the room of the greatest holy leaf in the house of Abdullah Pasha, in the room of the sister of AbdulBahr. By early 1899, AbdulBahr has laid the foundation stone for the shrine of the Bab, the same year that the remains arrive. Now, this photograph is a view of the shrine from the road which later becomes Ben Gurion Avenue, and halfway up the mountain, you see the completed shrine. But for this vignette, you have to imagine it is barren land and there is just a foundation stone laid. And finally, the sarcophagus arrives that very same year in 1899. And this is an extraordinary picture of a very large wooden crate with very beautiful wheels that contains the sarcophagus for the casket of the Bab in a house in Haifa somewhere, sometime before 1909. The identity of the Bahais standing in the photograph are unknown. That very same momentous year when so many things just happened, one more extraordinary thing happens. The first local spiritual assembly is elected in Tehran. The Baha'i administrative order is officially born. AbdulBahr has long helped the shattered Babi community in Iran and fostered its recognition of Baha'u'llah. So we have the four hands of the cause named by Baha'u'llah were members for life of the local spiritual assembly of Tehran. And I think this is the hand of the cause, Mirza Hassani Adib and Haji Mullah Ali Akbar, known as Haji Akund. These are two hands of the cause. Still in 1899, the first tablets of AbdulBahr begin to arrive in America. You see the systematization of the contact of AbdulBahr with the West. It's now becoming more regular, and AbdulBahr is already working on this first aim of his ministry. This is a tablet in the handwriting of AbdulBahr published in Star of the West in 1914. I have found some earlier ones from 1910, but the quality was not good enough to publish. By 1900, the next year, AbdulBahr transfers the remains from his sister, the greatest holy leaf's room in Abdullah Pasha in Akka, to Haifa. You see, this is Haifa here, this is Mount Carmel. You see the profile of Mount Carmel. All of this is done, of course, in very great secret. And soon after, AbdulBahr purchases the land for the shrine of the Bab and the access road to the shrine. Of course, all of these stories are in very, very great detail in Michael Day's book, journey to a mountain. So Abdul-Baha had asked, Baha'u'llah had asked Abdul-Baha in June 1891 to purchase the land. And that is what Abdul-Baha begins doing 8 years after the passing of Baha'u'llah. The owner of the future building site of the shrine is a very shrewd man, and he's very calculating. And he has also been corrupted by the covenant breakers. So negotiations with him are long and drawn out because he refuses to sell, because he's been poisoned by the enemies of Abdul-Baha. He then demands an outrageous price for opening an access road vital to the construction work. Because of course, if Abdul-Baha purchases the land, but then does not have an access road, he can't build, he can't bring stones in. So the access road is everything. Officials in Haifa raise endless objections, and Abdul-Baha has to repeatedly give them explanations and reassurances as their suspicions are easily aroused by the covenant breakers. Abdul-Baha himself concludes this dramatic episode of the purchase of the land and the access road. One night, I was so hemmed in by my anxieties that I had no other recourse than to recite and repeat over and over again a prayer of the Bab, which I had in my possession, the recital of which greatly calmed me. The next morning, the owner of the plot himself came to me, apologized, and begged me to purchase his property. By mid-1900, Abdul-Baha begins the construction of the shrine of the Bab. Beginning in 1901, we have another period of great opposition, and this is a difficult section of this part because the enemies of Abdul-Baha are absolutely ruthless, and Abdul-Baha comes very close to grave danger. This is a photograph of Damascus around the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Mirza Majid-Din, the devious son of Mirza Musa, egged on by Mirza Muhammad Ali, mortgages the mansion of Bahji and travels to Damascus with the money as bribes for Ottoman officials. In Damascus, he feeds lies to the governor and authorities, misrepresents the shrine Abdul-Baha is building as a fortress, and the flow of pilgrims as an army of foreign spies and military advisors. Abdul-Baha does not suspend work on the shrine, but takes precautionary measures. And one of these precautionary measures is that Abdul-Baha suspends all pilgrimage by Eastern and Western pilgrims during this extremely dangerous and very delicate time, because their presence and the associated festivities with incoming pilgrims would raise Ottoman suspicions even more. On the 20th of August, 1901, Abdul-Baha is interrogated for several days. This is the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, under which Abdul-Baha still lives in Ottoman Palestine, in the district of Syria, which is under the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The second crisis in the ministry of Abdul-Baha is precipitated by the actions of the covenant breakers in Damascus. Abdul-Baha, returning from Bahji after a holy day celebration, is informed by the governor of Akka that Sultan Abdul Hamid II has ordered the restrictions on his freedom should be reimposed. Abdul-Baha, after so many years, is re-incarcerated in Akka. For several consecutive days after August 20th, 1901, Abdul-Baha is subjected, alone and unaided, to a prolonged interrogation by judges and officials at government headquarters in Akka. One of the first things Abdul-Baha does is try and defend his brothers, also summoned for investigation. But this act does not soften his brothers' hearts. AbdulBah does succeed, however, in relaxing the restrictions imposed on the Baha'is in Akka, who can therefore continue to earn a living. It is interesting to note how the actions of the covenant breakers meant to harm AbdulBah backfire, because they are also brought back from their comfortable residences in the mansion of Bahji and in Tiberias, and they are also confined to the prison city of Akka. 1901-1902 crisis. The years 1901-1902 are dark days for AbdulBah. Rumors in Akka predicted terrible, devastating outcome, echoed in newspapers in Egypt and Syria. The attitude of the enemies of AbdulBah becomes more aggressive. Residents of Akka and Haifa develop a provocative attitude, steeled by the plottings of the covenant breakers. The master reroutes all of his mail through Egypt rather than Haifa, and directs the believers to gather and safeguard all the Baha'i holy writings in their possession, going so far as to ask them to leave Akka and move to Egypt, and forbidding Baha'i gatherings in the house of Abdullah Pasha. AbdulBah's friends and admirers stay away, afraid of being implicated. And AbdulBah's friends and AbdulBah's home, for many years the focus of so much activity, is utterly and completely deserted. Spies keep constant watch on his home and restrict his family's freedom. Between 1901 and 1908, there is also a tremendous amount of victory in the life of AbdulBah. During the darkest hours of these 8 years, as we're going to see in the details below, AbdulBah wins some of the greatest victories of his ministry. Not only does he begin work on the House of Worship in Ishkabad, but he also writes his will and testament. He rears the beginning of the administrative, spiritual, and education institutions of the faith. He oversees the spread of the faith in Canada, France, England, Germany, Egypt, Iraq, Russia, India, Burma, Japan, and the remote Pacific Islands. AbdulBah also spurs the translation, publication, and dissemination of Baha'i literature, and he himself pens up to 90 tablets in a single day. During this dark period, the master gathers Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Hindu, and Buddhist pilgrims, friends and inquirers from numerous counties. Every single Friday morning, no matter what danger he is in, AbdulBah, who has earned the title of Father of the Poor, distributes alms to the needy who fill his courtyard. In an interesting repetition of the life of Baha'u'llah, the 9 years before AbdulBah's birth, the 9 first years of his marriage with Asiya Khanum, Baha'u'llah was called the father of the poor, and his wife Asiya Khanum the mother of consolation. Nothing in AbdulBah's life, no matter how dangerous, severe, or worrisome to others, can shake his confidence and faith. Nothing stops AbdulBah from ministering to the poor, the orphans, the downtrodden, the sick, from calling in person to those who are too unwell or too ashamed to come to him. AbdulBah follows the illustrious examples of both the Bab and Baha'u'llah and refuses to flee, even when the Spanish consul uses his family relationships in a steamship company to place at Baha'u'llah's disposal an Italian freighter ready to take him to any port in the Mediterranean that he wishes to escape. Instead, AbdulBah, to the amazement of his friends and the amusement of his enemies, plants trees and vines in the garden of Abdullah Pasha. Between 1901 and 1908, from Akka, AbdulBah directs the construction of the Shrine of the Bab in Haifa. Because AbdulBah is unable to leave Akka, he has to supervise the building of the shrine, which he does not stop, even though he is re-incarcerated. And he directs the building in Haifa from his confinement in Akka. And while the construction of the shrine never halts, neither does the covenant breakers' scheming. So we're going to start seeing some extraordinary places in the chronology of Abdul-Bahá. And these places are located in the Jordan and the Jordan Valley and near Tiberias. In what is now Jordan, Adasiye, Tiberias, there are fields that are going to start appearing in this whole area here. And this is my favorite part of this chronology, what happens around Tiberias and Adasiye. So sometime in 1901, Abdul-Bahá purchases 2,000 acres of agricultural land. This is a photograph of a wheat field in the Jordan Valley in 1900. This is the exact geographical location where Abdul-Bahá purchased land. Adasiye, up here, is a village situated at the confluence of the Jordan and Yarmouk rivers and has a long history of settlements and farming stretching over 2,000 years. The three owners of the land of Adasiye, upon hearing that Abdul-Bahá in Haifa is a prospective buyer, decide to go and visit him. Abdul-Bahá agrees to the purchase and pays them 400 Turkish gold lira for the 2,272 acres of Adasiye. Once the purchase is complete, Abdul-Bahá returns a portion of the land back to the original owners, donates a portion of the land to the Mufti of Akka, and gives his brother Mirza Muhammad Ali 284 acres. This leaves Abdul-Bahá with 1,704 acres of land in the Jordan Valley. In December 1902, the foundation stone is laid for the first Baha'i House of Worship. And this photograph, my friends, is the laying of the foundation stone. It is the exact topic of this story. Undaunted by these terrible times in Akka, Abdul-Bahá presses on with the second of the three aims of his ministry. The foundation stone of the first Baha'i House of Worship in history is laid in a moving ceremony attended by General Kupatkin, the Governor General of Turkestan, now Turkmenistan, and the representative of the Russian Tsar. A Russian architect plans and executes the details of the construction laid out by Abdul-Bahá during Ustad Ali Akbar's pilgrimage in 1893, 1894. And the General Alexei Nikolaevich Kuropatkin is in the center of the photograph in this military uniform from the Imperial Russia. Next to him is Haji Muhammad Taqi Vakilud Daoli, the maternal cousin of the Bab. Look at how many people are there. So great. Between 1902 and 1907, the construction of the first Baha'i House of Worship. This is actually the construction of the first Baha'i House of Worship, but probably towards the end. So for 5 years, this construction is supervised by Ustad Ali Akbar Yazdi and Volkov, a Russian engineer. Americans are not to be undone. A year later, in June 1903, they ask for their own house of worship. And this is a very beautiful photograph of the house of worship, probably from a drone. Inspired by their Eastern counterparts in Ishqabad, who have started building the first Baha'i House of Worship, the Bahais of Chicago petition Abdul-Bahá for permission to build a house of worship in North America. And that, my friends, is the spirit of America. In June 1903, Abdul-Bahá gives them his enthusiastic approval, despite the small size of the community and their limited resources. On November 26, 1907, they appoint a committee of 9 to find a suitable site for the temple. On the 9th of April, 1908, they purchased 2 plots of land on the shores of Lake Michigan for $2,000. By 1910, 2 years before Abdul-Bahā's arrival, they raise $20,000 which converted for inflation in today's money is more than $500,000. That's America at its best. But of course, crisis follows victory, and by 1903, there are genocidal persecutions in Persia. This is a treatise written by AbdulBahr called Treatise on Persecution of Baha'is in 1903, translated by Ahang Rabbani, and you can download it with a link from the chronology. AbdulBahr experiences deep agony at the sufferings of the Baha'is in Iran when a vicious outbreak of persecution spreads across Persia. Baha'is are made the scapegoat for political pressures within and without the Persian government, and they are butchered in the most barbaric ways in Yazd and surrounding towns and villages. When the attempted genocide reaches its peak in the middle of the summer of 1903, AbdulBahr writes a proclamatory treatise outlining the events that led to this pogrom. The next year, in 1904, AbdulBahr presses on and instructs Agha Mirza Agha, an outstanding member of the family of the Bab, and the nephew of Munire Khanum, his wife, to immediately begin work on the restoration of the House of the Bab in Shiraz. This is a view of the courtyard of the House of the Bab in Shiraz. The original house where the Bab had declared his mission on the 23rd of May, 1844, has been altered with the passage of time. And under AbdulBahar's direction, Agha Mirza Agha prepares a plan which restores the house down to its very details to how it stood in the time of the Bab. That same year, 1904, a hostile new governor is appointed in Akka, who is deeply antagonistic to AbdulBahr. The covenant breakers circulate a petition in Akka and send it to Constantinople, along with preposterous allegations that AbdulBahr has already raised an army of 30,000 men and is building a fortress and an ammunitions depot on Mount Carmel, where AbdulBahr is building the shrine of the Bab, actually. So, no. But at the end of that year, AbdulBahr accurately predicts the end of the crisis. This is a photograph of Dr. Yunus Khan, who lived for 9 years with AbdulBahr in Akka between 1900 and 1909 and offered his medical services. At the end of the year of 1904, AbdulBahr's situation gradually returns to normal and pilgrimages resume. During this period, AbdulBahr recounts his sufferings at the hands of the covenant breakers to Dr. Yunus Khan and some pilgrims. The stories are so heartbreaking that everyone is deeply, deeply distressed. Dr. Yunus Khan asks AbdulBahr how long these covenant breakers will oppose him. AbdulBahr responds that in 4 years' time, the exact date at which he will be liberated from the Ottoman regime, that in 4 years' time, they will be powerless to act against him, and that in the future, there would be no trace of these covenant breakers left in the West. The next year, the crisis resumes at its worst. An official Ottoman report decrees in 10 June 1905 that AbdulBahr is to be exiled to Fizan, a dreaded area of South Libya controlled by the Ottoman Empire since the 17th century. AbdulBahr, unperturbed, continues his repairs on Abdullah Pasha, plants trees, and stores fuel for the winter. 11 days later, the Commission of Inquiry. This is the man who leads the Commission Inquiry. His name is Arif Bey. Sultan Abdul Hamid II begins to be alarmed as a result of both Mirza Muhammad Ali's constant fabrications against AbdulBahr and documents he sends to Ottoman officials. At one time, Mirza Muhammad Ali spreads the rumor that AbdulBaha is buying expanses of land destined for the shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel to establish his own kingdom. As a result, the Commission of Inquiry is sent from Istanbul to Akka to investigate what is happening with AbdulBaha and this land and this fortress and these pilgrims. The commission is headed by Arif Bey, who is so infuriated with AbdulBaha that this man pictured here, he actually is debating whether to hang him at the gate of Akka or maybe exiling him to Fizan in Libya, or just plain throwing him in the sea. AbdulBaha halts all pilgrimage once again and instructs the Baha'is in Akka to leave the city. AbdulBaha is interrogated by the Commission of Inquiry alone for several consecutive days to answer all their questions, including questions regarding the American pilgrims. And of course, this is the life of AbdulBaha, so get ready for a miracle. On a Friday in July 1905, the members of the commission inspect the shrine of the Bab's sepulcher and are impressed by not only its size, but its solidity. And they ask one of the attendants how many vaults exist under the massive structure. Shortly after the inspection, one day at sunset, the boat of the commission, which has been anchored off the coast of Haifa, because they're inspecting in Haifa, weighs anchor and heads towards Akka. The news spreads rapidly and everyone assumes the boat will stop long enough in Akka to take AbdulBaha on board, then head to Istanbul directly. The Holy Family is anguished at the idea of the separation from AbdulBaha. In this most tragic of all hours, AbdulBaha paces the courtyard of Abdullah Pasha alone and silent. Dusk falls, and it appears that the commissioned ship and their lights have swung around and the ship is changing course. They are now sailing, it looks like, towards Istanbul and not towards Akka. The members of the commission have just been urgently informed that they need to return to Istanbul immediately by telegram because they need to investigate the conspiracy behind the attempted assassination of Sultan Abdul Hamid II on July 21st, 1905. And these are images here. This is a photo montage illustrating the events around Sultan Hamid's attempted assassination. The large central image depicts the type of event, not the exact event, that the Sultan was attending at the Yildiz Hamidiyya Mosque during an Ottoman state ceremony in the late 19th century. In the top left is a picture dramatizing the Yildiz attempt, not an actual photograph. And then at the bottom is an actual newspaper clipping, the New York Times headline for July 22nd, 1905. So AbdulBaha, still pacing in his courtyard as night approaches, is immediately informed that the ship has left. Believers who had posted themselves at various places to watch the progress of the ship also confirmed the joyful news. One of the gravest dangers that has ever threatened AbdulBah's precious life has just been suddenly, providentially, and definitely averted. Look at the wealth and the richness of the texture of AbdulBah's life. A few months after this crisis, a completely different type of momentous event happens, and AbdulBah grants permission for Some Answered Questions to be published. This is the first edition of Some Answered Questions. Between 1904 and 1906, Laura Dreyfus Barney, the future wife of Hippolyte Dreyfus, compiles a collection of transcriptions of table talks given by AbdulBah at Akka in response to her very perspicuous and very astute questions. AbdulBah answers these questions during what he calls his tired moments. most often at meal times over the course of several visits by Laura Dreyfus to the Holy Land. In her introduction, Laura Dreyfus explains that AbdulBah's answers were written down in Persian for her own personal study, but that she believes others will find use in what has been so valuable to her, quote, since all men, notwithstanding their differences, are united in their search for reality. And so this prompts Laura Dreyfus to ask Baha'u'llah for permission to publish some answered questions in English. He grants the permission in 1906, and it's published in 1908. She is the one who will translate it. And the Persian text is called Talks During Luncheon. That's the name in Persian. One delightful moment in the writing of some answered questions is when AbdulBah is answering Laura Dreyfus Barney's questions on the subject of evil. The master turns to Yunus Khan and tells him, next, she will ask, how is it then that God hath created the scorpion? Which Laura Dreyfus does. If you want to hear a short excerpt from some answered questions in the original Persian and Arabic with English subtitles, you can click on this graphic in the chronology and you'll hear about education is of three kinds. 1907, the 6 rooms that form the basis of the Shrine of the Bab are completed. AbdulBah will often remark, every stone of that building, every stone of the road leading to it, I have with infinite tears and at tremendous cost raised and placed in position. That same year, the House of Worship in Ashgabat is complete, 1907. By 1907, the structure of the building is substantially complete, and the Mashkul Asghar stands as the most imposing building in the middle of Ashgabat, larger than any church or mosque in the city, bordered by 4 streets, surrounded by a large garden. Its dome is visible for miles. That same year, a girls' school is founded on the grounds. The building, however, is not yet complete, and its story will continue in a latter part. Undaunted by these terrible times in Akka, AbdulBah presses on with the second of his 3 aims in his ministry. In 1907, still that same year, AbdulBah asks the Spiritual Assembly of Tehran to send him some farmers. The Bahais of Yazd are mainly of Zoroastrian background, and they are traditionally farmers. And so they are selected as the most suitable for AbdulBah's request. As they, and Adasiye, this village situated at the confluence of the Jordan and Yarmouk rivers, and has a long history of settlements and farming stretching over 2,000 years. And so these Zoroastrian Persian Baha'i farmers from Iran are going to come and settle in the, this is the confluence kind of this is the general area of Adasiye. This is sort of like where the 2 rivers meet a little bit. Yeah. On the 1st of January, 1907, AbdulBah reveals what is perhaps one of his most famous tablets. This is a very beautiful portrait of AbdulBah by F. Souley Campbell. The origin and attribution of this portrait is not known. We don't know who owns it. AbdulBah's increasing contact with Western pilgrims and their devotion to him starts to cause confusion in the minds of some believers. The paradox of the mystery of God becomes a problematic reality because they are unable to reconcile that such a saintly character, the stainless mirror of Baha'u'llah's light, is not a manifestation of God, and is a human being, because he has all the outward appearances and all the spiritual qualities of a manifestation of God. So the New York Baha'is, in particular, Howard McNutt and Arthur P. Dodge, both disciples of AbdulBahr, have grave disputes over the station of AbdulBahr, some asserting he is the return of Jesus Christ, others not fully understanding that his station is not attainable by mere humans, no matter the perfections that any of us acquire. As early as 1900, AbdulBahr consistently strives to educate the friends and correct their misunderstanding regarding his rank. The tablet of AbdulBahr is where AbdulBahr clarifies his station eloquently. It is revealed on January 1st, 1907. It is addressed to the New York City Board of Council, and he dispels the notion that he himself occupies the same station as the Bab and Baha'u'llah. You can listen to this entire tablet on the Utterance Project in Persian with English subtitles. And I'm going to read some of it for you in a minute. You have written that there is a difference among the believers concerning the second coming of Christ. Gracious God, time and again this question has arisen, and its answer hath emanated in a clear and irrefutable statement from the pen of AbdulBahr, that what is meant in the prophecies by the Lord of hosts and the promised Christ is the blessed perfection Baha'u'llah and his holiness the exalted one, the Bab. My name is AbdulBahr. My qualification is AbdulBahr. My reality is AbdulBahr. My praise is AbdulBahr. Thraldom to the blessed perfection is my glorious and refulgent diadem, and servitude to all the human race, my perpetual religion. No name, no title, no mention, no commendation have I, nor will ever have, except AbdulBahr. This is my longing. This is my greatest yearning. This is my eternal life. This is my everlasting glory. Early 1907, AbdulBahr starts to move his family to Haifa, and here is a photograph of the German Templar colony in Haifa. Members of AbdulBahr's family began to live at 7 Persian Street, later Haparsim, in Haifa, which AbdulBahr designed and has been building for a few years with the financial help of Laura Clifford Barney, who also assisted with the purchase of the land. The house is located on the eastern edge of the German Templar colony. Between June and July 1908, AbdulBahr sends Shoghi Effendi to Haifa when Akka becomes too dangerous. This is a photograph of Shoghi Effendi, probably around the age of 6 or 7, I would say. Another edict by Sultan Hamid II is sent to authorities in Haifa to control AbdulBahr, who is labeled an agitator of a subversive group. But the Young Turk Revolution breaks out in July 1908 and compels the despot to reinstate the 1876 Constitution and free all religious and political prisoners held under his regime. Marian Jack arrives in January 1908 and teaches English to the Holy Family, including Shoghi Effendi, then a child of 11 years old. It is during this time that AbdulBahr begins calling her General Jack. AbdulBahr is under constant surveillance because of the incessant rumor mongering of the jealous covenant breakers. And he once again suspends visits by Western pilgrims. The situation becomes so dire that AbdulBah sends his favored grandson, Shoghi Effendi, to live in Haifa. He further instructs Shoghi Effendi not to drink coffee in other people's homes because it might contain poison. And some good news at last. August 1908, after 40 years as a prisoner of the Ottoman regime, AbdulBahr is now free. This is Sultan Abdul Hamid's II's announcement of a constitutional government in 1908. The Young Turk Revolution forces Sultan Abdul Hamid II to establish a constitutional government and release all political prisoners. In August 1908, AbdulBahr is released from imprisonment under the amnesty. After 55 years of imprisonment and exile, AbdulBahr is a free man at the age of 64 for the first time since he was a child in Iran. The first thing AbdulBahr does with his newly gained freedom is to visit the shrine of Baha'u'llah in Bahchi. During the years of his renewed imprisonment, the hardest sacrifice for AbdulBahr has been to not visit the shrine of Baha'u'llah. He would often say to pilgrims that he desired nothing more than the freedom to visit the shrine and would ask them to visit it on his behalf. As soon as he is free, AbdulBahr resumes his joyful task of beautifying the area around the shrine week after week, fetching as many as 60 jars of water on Fridays and Sundays when officials would visit him. By 1908, AbdulBahr completes the construction of his new home in Haifa, which is located on a street that will later be called Haparsim, which in Hebrew means Persian Street. After his release, AbdulBahr enjoys spending time on the balcony of the house of Abbas Quli of Qom. A small white room is built on the roof for him, and AbdulBahr also enjoys gazing at the shrine from the balcony of his house because he lives right next door to the shrine of the Bab. And if you want to learn more about this little room, you can read Journey to a Mountain. There is a lot of information there. 1908, 1960, a little bit about AbdulBahr and the farmers of Adassieh. This is a collage of all photos illustrating Adassieh in this part so far. And in part 8, just general areas of where it's located and people tilling with cows and like full-grown wheat and a little map. The Baha'i farmers from Iran arrived in groups between 1908 and 1916, and they began to settle in Adassieh, about 60 kilometers away from Haifa, near the Jordan River and the southern edge of the Sea of Galilee. When they have a difficult time adapting to the unbearable climate, rampant malaria, and attacks of highwaymen, AbdulBahr once tells them, "I have brought you to the most inhospitable place on earth." To comfort the Bahais and their families suffering from the unbearable climate, the malaria, the mosquito infestations, and attacks on them, AbdulBahr reveals a special prayer for them who have traversed mountains, deserts, plains, and prairies to ask God for guidance. But he also gives them concrete advice, which solves their malaria and mosquito problem. He instructs the farmers to plant a type of eucalyptus that produces the drug quinine in its bark, Quincuna quina. And each farmer plants these trees, which can still be seen standing today. AbdulBahr tells the farmers that by working this land, they are contributing to the shrines of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. He takes a great interest in the agricultural development of the community and visits the villages as often as he is able to. AbdulBahr stays with the families in the village, gives to the poor and needy, advises on the social development of the community and how to establish bonds of friendship with their Arab, Christians, and Muslim neighbors. AbdulBaha envisions an orphanage in Adasiye and advises the Baha'is to engage in crafts and small rural industries. During his visits to Adasiye, AbdulBaha, always a fine horseman, rides on a horse and trots through the valleys and lanes of the village towards the dam after the village of Bakura on the river. The next, a very exciting story of Adasiye will continue in part 8, when AbdulBaha averts a famine with wheat and corn from the Jordan Valley during World War I. And now Baha'u'llah completes the second of his 3 objectives. On the 21st of March, actually, the remains of the Bab are finally laid to rest after 60 years. Before he is to leave Akka for Haifa, AbdulBaha gives instructions for the removal of the heavy marble sarcophagus to the shrine of the Bab on Mount Carmel. By the light of a single lamp, AbdulBaha removes his turban, his shoes, and his dark outer cloak. Bareheaded and barefoot, in simple white garments, AbdulBaha descends into the vault and places the wooden casket containing the sacred remains of the Bab and his companion in the marble sarcophagus, then bends low over the casket and weeps with such a weeping that everyone present cries with him. The ebony lid of the coffin is secured and the marble lid of the sarcophagus closes forever. AbdulBaha chants the prayer of the dead because this is the first time the Bab is laid to rest. Overcome with emotion, AbdulBaha cannot sleep that night. Soon after, he writes to the Bahais of the world. The most joyful tidings is this, that the holy, the luminous body of the Bab, after having for 60 years been transferred from place to place, by reason of the ascendancy of the enemy, and from fear of the malevolent, and having known neither rest nor tranquility, has, through the mercy of the Abha beauty, been ceremoniously deposited on the day of Nowruz within the sacred casket in the exalted shrine on Mount Carmel. With the interment of the remains of the Bab to their permanent resting place on Mount Carmel, AbdulBaha achieves the third objective of his ministry. Shoghi Effendi states that this act deserves to rank as one of the most outstanding events in the first Baha'i century. The interment of the remains of the Bab is spiritually significant. The Bab, whose advent marks the return of the prophet Elijah, is now interned on Mount Carmel, a holy mountain in close proximity to Elijah's caves. Baha'i pilgrims around the world now have 2 shrines to visit, not just one. Baha'u'llah's shrine in Bahji and the Bab's shrine in Haifa. On the very same day, 21st of March, 1909, the first national convention in America. And this is a photograph of that convention, the Temple Unity Conference. On March 21st, 1909, 17 years after the passing of Baha'u'llah and 17 years into the ministry of Abdul-Baha, AbdulBaha accomplishes the first of his goal that he had set himself, which is the establishment of the faith in North America. 39 delegates from 36 cities on the 21st of March, 1909, on purpose on the same day that Abdul-Baha was interring the remains of the Bab on Mount Carmel in Haifa, assemble in Chicago for what is the first national convention of the United States. They incorporate a permanent national organization known as the Baha'i Temple Unity, bound by the laws of the state of Illinois and empowered to hold the title to the House of Worship property and provide means for its building. October 1909, Dr. Susan Moody and AbdulBaha. Around 1908, a group of American Baha'is returned to Akka from Persia and tell AbdulBaha that there is a great need for a woman doctor there, as Persian women will not unveil themselves in front of male doctors. AbdulBaha inquires about a female doctor. Dr. Susan Moody's name comes up. At the age of 52 in 1903, Susan Moody had suddenly returned to medical school and earned her degree, the age of 52. So when AbdulBaha sends her a message telling her she has been chosen for this position, Dr. Moody will say later she understood why she had felt such a strong urge to study medicine. So she leaves immediately for Persia upon receiving AbdulBaha's message, but she stops in the Holy Land to see AbdulBaha between the 8th and the 12th of October 1908. On October 12th, she receives instructions from AbdulBaha to leave the next day for Istanbul before the weather becomes too cold, and tells her that she will find things difficult in Persia. Many of the people are poor, there are no beds. You must not look at their circumstances, but their hearts. Dr. Moody will minister to the medical needs of Persian women for 15 years and will return to her post until her death at the age of 77, opening a hospital and helping start a girls' school during her time in Persia. And so we're going to end with this section tonight. This is AbdulBaha immediately before he leaves for his journeys to the West. And his journeys to the West are going to occupy the next few days of our life, or the evenings, or storytelling sessions. In August 1910, AbdulBaha moves in himself to his final home, the Master's house at 7 Haparsim, 7 Persian Street. When he moves in, the house is already filled with family who have been there since 1907, so for 3 years, and 2 of his daughters are going to live close by with their families. 7 Haparsim, the Master's house, is always filled with children, servants, pilgrims, and guests. On the 6th of August, 1910, only little Shoghi has the shadow of a great calling in the depths of his eyes. There are very few records of how people who aren't Baha'i would have seen AbdulBaha and his grandson. We're very lucky from the Priceless Pearl written by Amatul Bahariya Khanum, the widow of the Guardian, to have the testimony of Dr. J. Falshear, a woman physician, who records her impressions when she's called one day to the Master's house to help with a finger of a maid, the cut finger of a maid. So once she's attended to her patient, she's sipping coffee with the ladies of the Holy Family when she's summoned by AbdulBaha to the drawing room. And AbdulBaha asks after the finger of the maid. And then Shoghi Effendi, 13 years old, enters the room behind his father and greets his beloved grandfather with a kiss on the hand, then remains motionless near the door. People come and go, but Dr. Falshear can't take her eyes off of Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi's dressed in European summer clothes, a short jacket, shorts, and socks above his knees. And the perceptive physician is really, really struck by Shoghi Effendi's dark, already mature and melancholy eyes in his childish face. Before leaving the room, his father whispers something to Shoghi Effendi, and then who then approaches AbdulBaha, waits to be spoken to, and answers in Persian. AbdulBaha laughs, dismisses him, and Shoghi Effendi kisses his grandfather's hands again and walks backwards out of the room, his dark, loyal eyes never leaving AbdulBaha's. For a short moment, a silence follows, and AbdulBaha asks Dr. Falshear, "Now, my daughter, how do you like my future Elijah?" Dr. Falshear responds, "Master, if I may speak openly, I must say that in this boy's face are the dark eyes of a sufferer, one who will suffer a great deal." AbdulBaha looks away, and then after a long time, turns back to Dr. Falshear and says, "My grandson does not have the eyes of a trailblazer, a fighter, or a victor. But in his eyes, one sees deep loyalty, perseverance, and conscientiousness. And do you know why, my daughter, he will fall heir to the heavy inheritance of being my vizier, my minister, kind of? Baha'u'llah, the great perfection, blessed be his words, in the past, the present, and forever, chose AbdulBah, this insignificant one, to be his successor, not because I was the firstborn, but because his inner eye had already discerned on my brow the seal of God. Before his ascension into eternal light, the blessed manifestations reminded me that I too, irrespective of primogeniture, means firstborn, or age, must observe among my sons and grandsons whom God would indicate for his office. My sons passed to eternity in their tenderest years. In my line among my relatives, only little Shoghi has the shadow of a great calling in the depth of his eyes. AbdulBah pauses for a long time before continuing. At the present time, the British Empire is the greatest and still expanding, and its language is the world language. My future vizier shall receive the preparation for his weighty office in England itself, after he has obtained in Palestine here a fundamental knowledge of the Oriental languages and the wisdoms of the East. Dr. Falshir interjects, will not the Western education, the English training, remold his nature, confine his versatile mind in the rigid bonds of intellectualism, stifle through dogma and convention his Oriental irrationality and intuition, so that he will no longer be a servant of the Almighty, but rather a slave to the rationality of Western opportunism and the shallowness of everyday life? I am not giving my Elijah to the British to educate. I dedicate and give him to the Almighty. God's eyes watch over my child in Oxford as well, inshallah. AbdulBahr leaves the Holy Land without anyone's knowledge. Part 1, The Accomplice. 29th of August, 1910. AbdulBahr leaves the Holy Land as a free man after 40 years of imprisonment without informing his family and the body of believers, therefore without a public farewell, which would have attracted a lot of unwanted attention, especially from our covenant breakers. AbdulBahr could not, however, have left Haifa without assistance. So AbdulBahr did tell someone he was leaving. This person was Mirza Jalal, the husband of Ruha Hanum, his third daughter, and the son of Mirza Muhammad Hassan, the king of martyrs. 3 years and 3 months later, Mirza Jalal will tell the entire story to Ahmad Sohram in Ramleh, Egypt, in 1913. On the day before AbdulBahr leaves, on Sunday, August 28th, 1910, all the Holy Family is in Akka, with the exception of Mirza Jalal's wife, Ruha Hanum. One thing that is crucial to this story is that Mirza Jalal's house is connected to the master's house. Both facts, that the houses are connected and the master's house is relatively empty, have greatly facilitated Mirza Jalal's second task. So, part 2, the steamer ticket and the luggage. This is an example of a steamer ticket, a contract for passage on the Cunard line from Copenhagen to America in 1905. So, just a general idea of what a ticket would look like. On this Sunday, August 28th, AbdulBahr summons Mirza Jalal and asks him if he can perform an important and confidential mission. AbdulBahr tells him, you can go to the steamship agency and get for me 1 first-class ticket without giving my name. Mirza Jalal immediately heads to the agent's office when he realizes he has no money. When he arrives, the agent asks for a name under which to book the first-class ticket to Port Said, Egypt. Mirza Jalal gives him a random name, tells the agent he will stop by to pay him for the ticket tomorrow, then immediately returns to AbdulBahr and hands the master the ticket. AbdulBahr's second instructions to Mirza Jalal is, you must now transfer my satchels from my room to your home without a single soul seeing them. The fact that everyone is in Akka right now and that both houses touch each other and that they're pretty empty greatly facilitates Mirza Jalal's discreet accomplishment of this delicate task. AbdulBah's luggage is not moved again until nightfall. Part 3, the visit to the shrine and the travel companions. These are some visitors to the shrine of the Bab in Haifa in 1910. Next, AbdulBah tells Mirza Jalal, tell the driver to make ready my carriage. I will go to the tomb of the Bab to meet my friends. From there, I will go direct to the steamer. You also, by some roundabout way, bring my baggages. Send word to Mirza Nureddin to be ready to accompany me, and send us Agha Khosrau with the next steamer. AbdulBah visits the shrine that afternoon. Then, as he leaves, shakes the hand of every believer present and bids them each farewell, something they will only understand the next day. Then AbdulBah walks down Mount Carmel from the shrine of the Bab and steps directly onto the Qusair, about to depart for Egypt and the beginning of the Master's 3-year journeys to the west. When they arrive at the Qusair, the steamer is full, and AbdulBah chooses 2 of the believers to accompany him to Egypt, Abdul Hussein and Mirza Munir Zain, who is one of the sons of the Apostle of Baha'u'llah and preeminent transcriber of his tablets, Zain ul Mukharrabin. Part 4, the steamer chair. These are a set of steamer chairs from the 19th century. This is what we're talking about right now. AbdulBah asks for a steamer chair, but there are none available. One of the rowers who row people aboard on little boats and then row back ashore and then row more people aboard goes to find one. Later, as the man is rowing them ashore, Mirza Jalal says, well, but how did you get a steamer chair for AbdulBah since there were none? So the rower says that he couldn't find any chairs, couldn't find any free chairs. So he went down to the 3rd class and he came upon some Arabs that were fighting each other over, that were sitting on steamer chairs. So he provoked a fight between the 2 Arab men, and the Arab men both got up from their steamer chairs, and he just simply grabbed one of the chairs and ran back and brought it to AbdulBah. There's no point to this story, and I could have not included it, but I love it a lot, so I did, and it's my chronology. Part 5, the Master's Cabin. This is the 1st class cabin in the steamer SS Koning Albert. I don't know what this 1st class cabin looked like in the Qusair, but as the Qusair is full, Mirza Jalal is not able to find a private cabin for AbdulBah, who is going to have to share his cabin with an Englishman until they dock in Port Said in 2 days. AbdulBah jokes about the situation, saying, never mind, we can very well get along with an Englishman. AbdulBah is still giving Mirza Jalal and other friends instructions when the steamer whistle blows and the friends hastily leave the ship. Part 6, the departure. This is the Khedivial Mainline Steamer Company's Qusair. This, my friends, is the boat that took the ship that took AbdulBah from Haifa to Port Said, the actual ship. This is the one I was telling you about that I bought for $4 to have permission to put it on my chronology. In the darkness of the night, Mirza Jalal and his companions can see the outline of the Qusair making for the Mediterranean Sea, carrying away AbdulBah free and out into the world after 40 years of imprisonment. AbdulBah will not return to the Holy Land and his beloved shrines for 3 full years. The most outstanding achievement that will forever be associated with AbdulBah's ministry, according to Shoghi Effendi, is about to begin. See you tomorrow for day 7, and we're going to start AbdulBah's Journeys to the West, part 1.
Wow, thank you so much, Violetta. So would you like to close this out and then we can stop the recording?
Sure. I wanted to say that this wonderful experience with everyone here and everyone on YouTube, you guys on YouTube, you're part of this too. Thank you so much for your comments, are just so wonderful. And we're just having such a wonderful time with AbdulBahr right now, all of us together, wherever we may be joining from. And I want to thank the people that made this possible. Firm Foundation Academy and Peter Terry for coming up with this idea. Want to thank the Clearwater Bahais for all that they do for the progress of the faith and the education of people in Baha'i history and Baha'i theology. And thank you to Desert Rose Baha'i Institute, our third partner. They do magnificent work. Please visit their website and like their page on Facebook. And please subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of content every week. And we've been talking a lot about the Ottoman Empire, and I want to encourage everybody to join us on Sunday, the October 1st and Sunday, October 8th, for a series of 2 talks by the world expert on the Ottoman Empire and the Baha'i faith, Dr. Najati Alkan. So if you want to know about that, you can go to the Clearwater website. You'll see their talk listed. Thank you, everyone, and see you tomorrow.